The pilot's name was stenciled on the instrument panel in faded tape, Kowalski Yk. He never told me that himself. He never told me anything. 4 hours and 20 minutes in a Cessna Caravan loaded with my gear, 6 weeks of personal provisions, and a crate of replacement generator parts, and Kowalczyk said exactly 11 words to me across the entire flight. 8 of them were radio call-outs to air traffic. The remaining 3 came after we landed. After the wheels touched the gravel strip and the engine noise dropped to idle, and he set the brake and turned to look at me with the specific expression of a man who has made this particular run enough times to have developed an opinion about it. He said, "Good luck, kid. I'm 36. I haven't been a kid since the winter. I pulled 2 bodies out of a crevasse on the Brooks Range and carried one of them on a sled for 9 miles because the helicopter couldn't land in the wind. I didn't correct him. I just grabbed my bag and got out, and by the time my boots hit the gravel, he was already rolling back toward the runway, and I stood there in -34°C watching the plane bank south until it became a speck and then became nothing, and I was alone." Cold Frame Station Kylo sits on the north slope of Alaska, 200 miles above the Arctic Circle, on a flat expanse of tundra, so geometrically featureless that the horizon looks like a pencil line drawn with a ruler against a sky that has forgotten how to be anything but dark. It was early November. The sun had not risen above the horizon in 11 days and would not rise again for 3 months. The darkness up here is not like other darkness. It is not the ordinary night that comes when the sun sets and goes when it rises. It is a structural darkness, a darkness built into the geography, and you understand within the first hour that you are not in a dark version of a familiar world. You are in a different world that happens to contain some familiar objects. The depot is 4 prefabricated buildings connected by covered walkways, arranged in a rough square, the main operations building to the south, the supply warehouse to the east, the generator shed to the west, and to the north, flush against the operations building's entire back wall, a structure labeled AUXI Leary in white stenciling on a metal door that is secured with a padlock the size of my fist. No windows on the Axillary building, none. I stood in front of it for about 30 seconds before the cold reminded me that 34 below is not a temperature you stand around in while you're thinking, and I moved on. I activated the heating systems first. That is not optional at this latitude. That is a survival step with a countdown. And while the buildings climbed toward habitable temperature, I did my first walkthrough with a flashlight, and my coat still zipped to the chin. The operations building was standard. A long desk along the south wall with a satellite phone mount, 2 monitors, a whiteboard with nothing written on it, and a filing cabinet beside the desk with 12 years of supply logs stacked in labeled binders. The heating ducts ran along the ceiling and made the specific metallic tick of cold metal warming up, which in a fully silent building sounds more like communication than expansion. I checked every room, checked the walkways between buildings. I checked the warehouse. 30-foot ceilings, rows of emergency supply pallets on steel shelving, medical equipment in sealed cases, fuel drums in neat rows. I found the emergency protocols binder on the operations desk, which was expected. I found the handwritten sheet of paper tucked inside its front cover, which was not. I read it standing at the desk with my coat still on, because I had not yet made the cognitive transition from field assessment to settled occupant, and some part of me was still processing the environment as a scene to be secured. The handwriting was small and careful and consistent, someone who wrote slowly and deliberately, someone accustomed to writing things that needed to be read correctly under poor conditions by people who might be under stress. There were 6 rules. I read them all the way through once, standing with the professional detachment of a person processing a briefing document. Then I read them again. Then I sat down and read them a 3rd time, slowly, because by the 2nd reading I understood that the prices attached to each rule were not metaphorical. Rule 1 told me to conduct a full interior perimeter check of the main building and warehouse at 1 a.m. every night, logging every anomaly, sounds, temperature differentials, any object not in its logged position. The price read, the check exists because it knows when you stop looking. The moment you stop looking, it reclassifies you from observer to inventory. I turned that sentence over in my mind for a moment. Inventory. Not prey, not target, not victim. Inventory. The language of a supply depot. The language chosen by someone who understood the specific horror of being reclassified from person to thing within the logistics of a system that was already running before you arrive. Rule Do: address the receiver on the desk. The olive green Soviet-era box bolted to the surface, its analog dial fixed at a position nobody chose, its power cable hardwired into the building's electrical system in a way that made removal a structural project rather than a simple disconnection. The receiver would produce transmissions during polar duct conditions, the rule said. Between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., when the Arctic wind dropped below a certain threshold and the atmosphere above the North Slope produced its cold channel of perfectly conducted signal, the receiver would receive. I was not to respond to anything I heard, regardless of content, urgency, or how well I recognized the voice. Log time and duration only. The price, responding, establishes a two-way channel. You become locatable. Once it can locate you through the frequency, the Arctic stops being a barrier and starts being a corridor. Rule 3 was about the AU Auxiliary building. Stay back after dark. Don't listen at the door. Don't stand within 10 feet of it after sunset. The price: the AU Auxiliary building is aware of proximity. Attention is reciprocal. I thought about the 30 seconds I had spent in front of that padlocked metal door with no windows, already processing the geometry of the building, already curious about what was inside. I thought about the word reciprocal and what it implied about the direction of awareness. I did not go back to the AU Auxiliary building that night. Rule 4 described a specific scenario: a temperature drop of more than 6 degrees in under 4 minutes without mechanical explanation. If that happened, I was not to go to the windows. I was to stand in the center of the room and wait until the temperature restored. The price: the windows show you what caused the drop. Seeing what caused the drop is the mechanism by which it introduces itself. Introduction is not reversible. Rule 5 was not a rule. It was a rectangle. The text beneath it had been covered in correction fluid. Not one coat, not a single pass of the brush, but multiple thick coats, layer upon layer, until the surface was a raised slab that caught the light differently than the surrounding paper. Someone had taken time with this. Someone had been thorough. Below the rectangle, scratched directly into the paper in a different tool, a nail maybe, or a key, were 2 words: not yet. Rule 6: address time. I would lose track of it, the rule said. This was expected and manageable. I was to keep 3 clocks: analog, digital, and mechanical wind-up, and log all 3 every hour. If they agreed, trust the time. If any disagreed with the others, trust none of them until consensus restored. The price: it operates in the gaps between agreed times. Disagreement between clocks is not malfunction. It is a door. I sat with that sheet of paper for 20 minutes. I had been a search and rescue technician for 9 years. I had operated in conditions that would be fatal to most people, and I had done it with a protocol binder and a team and a radio that connected me to the world below. I was familiar with the specific psychology of high-risk, isolated postings, the pattern of thought that begins practical and ends somewhere else. I understood that the person who wrote these rules had been under stress when they wrote them. I understood that stress produces distortion. I understood all of this, and I believed none of it, because the rules had the specific internal coherence of things written by someone who had already tested them. Rules that come from imagination have gaps. These rules had no gaps. They anticipated follow-up questions I hadn't yet thought to ask. They were written by someone who had already been where I was going. At 1:98 a.m., on my first night 7 minutes into the interior perimeter check, I had begun, with the methodical precision that search and rescue had put into my bones and never fully extracted. The receiver activated. I was in the northeast corner of the operations room, logging a temperature reading, when the speaker crackled to life with the sharp, definitive tone of a signal locking in. No static buildup, no gradual resolve. Present and clear, the way sounds in the Arctic when the duct is open and the distance between source and receiver has been collapsed by atmospheric conditions into something that doesn't behave like distance at all. A male voice. Calm. Professional. A standard weather observation report. Cloud ceiling. Visibility. Wind speed at 3,000 feet. Barometric pressure and trend. The kind of report I had filed myself dozens of times from extraction sites and staging camps across the North Slope when weather was the difference between a successful recovery and a delayed one. The coordinates he gave were the exact coordinates of Coldframe Station Kilo. I had memorized those coordinates before I left Fairbanks. 70 degrees, 21 minutes north, 148 degrees, 6 minutes west. The voice on the receiver gave them without hesitation. The way you give coordinates you have recited so many times they have become reflexive. And then, as I stood with my logbook open and my pen not moving, the sound of the voice completed its full register in my auditory cortex, and my brain did what it does with familiar input. It matched the pattern to its stored examples and produced a recognition that I immediately tried to reject and could not, because there is a specific quality to the sound of your own voice when you hear it from outside your own head. A slightly flattened resonance that recording always captures and that is unmistakable once you hear it. And the my voice giving a weather report for my coordinates. At 1:08 a.m. on my first night at a posting, I had arrived at 14 hours earlier. I did not respond. I wrote the time in the log 01.08 and stood at the desk with my pen on the paper and listened to my voice report the weather until the transmission ended and the receiver clicked back to its between signal hum and the operations room was quiet again except for the metallic tick of the heating ducts and the sound of my own breathing, which was controlled, because I am trained for controlled breathing in abnormal situations, and the thing I was doing with my breathing was the only normal thing in the room. I am methodical. This is the thing about me that kept me alive through 9 years of North Slope search and rescue, and it is also, in a different register, the thing that has occasionally gotten me into situations that a less thorough person would have had the good sense to leave alone. I cannot walk past an unexamined document. I cannot accept a partial data set. I cannot leave a binder on a shelf when I know it contains 12 years of information about the place I am currently living alone in, 200 miles above the Arctic Circle, in November, with a set of handwritten rules whose prices involve irreversibility. By the end of my first week, I had read everything in the operations building: the satellite phone manual, the generator maintenance logs, the emergency protocols binder in its entirety, and the supply logs, all 12 years of them stacked in their labeled binders in the filing cabinet beside the desk, each winter's posting recorded in a different hand. The names were in the officer log at the front of each binder: Yevgeny, Hartley, Sujin, Price, Okafor, Brennan, and 4 others. 9 postings before me. 9 different people who had flown into Kilo on a cargo plane and received the same handwritten sheet and stood in the same operations room and made the same decision I had made, which was to stay and follow the rules rather than call the contracting office and demand extraction. I don't know why they all made that decision. I know why I made mine. My reasons were financial and practical, and also, if I am honest, something harder to name: a professional stubbornness that functions as courage in some situations and as a serious flaw in others, and that has never learned to distinguish between the two. The early entries for each officer were distinct. Yevgeny wrote in a formal, almost bureaucratic style: temperatures, inventory counts, generator fuel levels, nothing personal. The log of someone who had decided the document was official and should read that way. Hartley was the opposite: chatty, discursive, full of observations about the sky and the sound of the wind and the strange beauty of the North Slope in winter that I recognized from my own relationship with this landscape, the specific love that the Arctic produces in people who stay long enough to stop being afraid of it. Suljin wrote with the precision of an engineer, every entry time-stamped to the minute, every anomaly categorized and cross-referenced. The log of someone whose primary tool for managing an uncertain environment was exhaustive documentation: different people, different priorities, different voices on the page. But I read sequentially. I read each binder beginning to end in chronological order, and reading sequentially is what revealed the thing that I am certain no previous officer had noticed, because it required the full 12 years to see. By February of each posting, every posting, without exception, the handwriting changed. Not dramatically. Not the way handwriting changes when someone is frightened or ill or injured. Subtly, a tightening of the letter forms, a narrowing of the word choices, a flattening of individual style towards something more uniform. Hartley's chatty discursiveness became clipped. Sujin's engineering precision became something more like ritual. Okafor's entries, which in November had been full of specific observations and personal asides, became by February indistinguishable in tone from Yevgeny's formal bureaucratic style. And Yevgeny had posted 3 years before Okafor, and they had never met, and there was no mechanism by which they could have influenced each other's writing, except through the environment they had both inhabited. The same operations room, the same winter light, the same receiver humming on the same desk. February 14th appeared in 6 of the 12 years' logs, with entries so nearly identical in content that I pulled all 6 binders off the shelf and laid them open side by side on the operations desk to confirm what I was reading. The specific wording varied only in proper nouns. One said, "Wind is down," another said, "The wind has dropped." But the meaning, the structure, the specific sequence of observations, receiver activity, a statement of understanding, and intention were the same across 6 different officers, 6 different native languages, 6 different personalities that had by February been reduced to the same narrow frequency. I think I understand what it wants. I think I am going to try talking to it tonight. 6 variations of that sentence, 6 officers who wrote it. None of the 6 completed their rotation. The 3 who did complete their rotations. I went back and studied them with the specific attention of someone looking for a survival pattern. Their entries did not go convergent. Their handwriting in February was different from their handwriting in November, but differently different, more worn, more private, as if February had compressed something rather than replaced it. They wrote less, they documented more precisely, they used shorter sentences. One of them, Price, who had posted 7 years ago and whose entries had the flat affect of someone deliberately limiting their own emotional range, wrote on February 12th of his rotation, "Not going to the receiver tonight, not going to try to understand it, going to fix the secondary generator's fuel intake valve instead, which has been sticking in the cold, and then I'm going to sleep." I wrote Price's name on a piece of paper and taped it to my monitor. Below it I wrote Hartley, and then the third name, Okafor. No, Okafor hadn't made it. I checked again. The third survivor was a woman named Chen, posting 8 years ago, whose entries I had skimmed because they were sparse and I had not initially registered their sparseness as a methodology rather than a temperament. I went back and read Chen carefully. She had, I realized, been deliberately not looking at the receiver. She had logged its activation times and durations without comment. Time in, time out. No notation of content, no notation of the voice, nothing that indicated she had processed what she heard as meaningful information rather than ambient noise. She had treated it like a fire alarm, logged that it sounded, not what it meant. Price had fixed things. Chen had not listened. Hartley, I found Hartley's last entry, February 8th of his rotation. I know what the voice is now. I know who it is. I have to answer it. Hartley had not completed his rotation. I wrote Chen's name under Price's on the paper taped to my monitor, and I studied both of them, and I started doing the things they had done, fixing the things that needed fixing, and logging the receiver's activations as times and durations only, nothing else, treating the sounds as data rather than communication, choosing the wrench over the headset. That night the receiver activated at 1:17 a.m. The polar duct, I was learning, was not as seasonal as the handwritten rules had implied. It opened when the conditions were right, and the conditions in this first Arctic November were right more often than not. The voice was female, efficient, accented, Korean-inflected English, precise consonants, the cadence of someone giving a report they have given many times. I wrote the time, and I wrote female voice, English, technical report, and I started to close the log entry, and then the coordinates locked me in place the way coordinates always do when they correspond to a location you can visualize. The voice was reporting from 30 miles north-northwest of the depot. I knew that bearing. I had studied the maps. 30 miles north-northwest of Kilo was the permanent ice shelf. Not sea ice, not seasonal pack, but the deep geological shelf that the Arctic builds over centuries and has been building since before this depot existed, before the Cold War, before the receiver was installed, before anyone had a reason to be here. 30 miles north-northwest was where nothing was. And net in the one, and the permanent ice, and a voice that I recognized from her 30s for Tom would quoted Thurdany, crew from Martikon on February 11th of her rotation, and who was listed in the officer log as not having completed her posting, was out there in the nothing, giving a weather report, alive in the frequency if not in the body. And I wrote the time and the duration, and I did not speak and I did not go to the window. Spice the sill. Spiltstated Untold. The tundra does not lie. This is the thing about the Arctic that every person who works in it eventually comes to understand. There is no cover, no canopy, no visual ambiguity in the terrain. The North Slope in winter is a flat white plain extending to a flat black horizon, and everything on that plain is visible from a distance that would conceal the same thing in a forest or a mountain range, or anywhere that the landscape offers complexity for a presence to inhabit. When something is out there on the tundra, you can see it. The distance is the only variable, and the distance is honest. It tells you exactly how far away the thing is, and exactly how long it has been standing in the cold. Cold frame station Kilo's exterior lights run on two systems: a motion sensor array that covers the perimeter fence and activates on detection, and a timed sweep that activates at 2 a.m. every night to illuminate the full perimeter for a rolling 17-minute cycle. The sweep was automatic, consistent, and for my first 7 nights entirely unremarkable. The lights came on. They swept the fence and the tundra beyond it. They illuminated the gravel yard and the supply structures and the pale-packed surface of the airstrip, and they showed me nothing but terrain and equipment and the specific midnight blue of an Arctic sky on a clear night where the stars are so dense they produce a faint ambient light even without the moon. Night 8, the sweep activated at 2001 a.m., 1 minute behind schedule, which I logged because the clocks had agreed on the time and the discrepancy was in the sweep system rather than in my timekeeping, which made it a mechanical anomaly rather than the kind of anomaly Rule 6 was addressing. The lights moved across the yard and the fence and out across the open tundra in their standard pattern, that wide, flat illumination that turns the Arctic snow into something between white and silver. And at the edge of the sweep's reach, approximately 200 meters from the outer fence, which is the practical limit of the system's intensity at that range, there was a figure, an upright human figure, standing in the full center of the open tundra, with nothing around it for 200 meters in every direction in -38°C, without visible cold weather gear. I had the binoculars up in 4 seconds. Search and rescue does not leave your hands. The muscle memory of reaching for optics when you see something at distance is the kind of habit that embeds itself below the level of decision-making, below the level of, I should check that, down into the level of the body's own assessment of what needs confirming. I had them up and focused in 4 seconds. The figure was the right height and proportions for an adult male, standing directly upright, not crouched, not moving, not angled into the wind the way a person angling into an Arctic wind automatically angles, just standing. The way a person stands when they are not cold. The way a person stands when the temperature is not relevant to them. The perimeter light swept across the figure without the figure reacting. No turn of the head toward the light source. No hand raised against the glare. No movement at all. Faces are not resolvable at 200 meters, even with good binoculars in Arctic light, and the figure's face was turned toward the depot. But it was a pale direction rather than a legible expression. It stood there for the full 17 minutes of the sweep cycle. I watched it for all 17 minutes of the sweep cycle. At 2018, the sweep cycled off, and the tundra went back to the faint ambient blue of stars and the figure was in the dark again, and I checked the time on all 3 clocks. 2018, 2018, 2018, 2018. They agreed they always agreed in those early weeks, and I waited for the 2030 sweep. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. I went immediately to the binoculars. Swept the full visible tundra in a systematic arc, near to far, left to right, twice. Nothing. I watched until 2047. Nothing moved. When dawn was still 8 weeks away and the darkness was not a condition that would change by morning, I put on my full cold weather gear and walked the fence perimeter to the nearest point to where the figure had been standing. The snow was unmarked. I searched in a grid pattern for 15 minutes. I know how to search. I know what ground sign looks like and what it doesn't look like. I know the difference between wind-disturbed snow and undisturbed snow, and between undisturbed snow and the stewed that has been disturbed and then restored, which is a different texture and a different color if you know what you're looking for. There was nothing. No compression, no track outline, no scatter of disturbed crystals at the margins where a weight displaced snow onto the surface around it. No wind in the previous 17 minutes, sufficient to cover a human track. Nothing. I logged the word figure in the operations log and then stared at it for a long time before I decided it was the accurate word and left it. In the morning, in what passed for morning at that latitude and season, which was a slightly less dark period beginning around 11 a.m., I called the contracting office on the satellite phone. The contractor I reached was a man named Garrett, whose voice I recognized from the hiring process. Professionally neutral, the specific vocal affect of someone trained to manage information intake and output without providing more of either than the situation technically required. I described the figure. I was precise and factual about it, the way I had been trained to be precise and factual when reporting observations in the field, because precision and factuality are what distinguish an observation report from a disturbance report, and I wanted very much to be filing an observation report. Garrett was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he asked if I was sleeping enough. I told him I had been a search and rescue technician on the North Slope for 9 years, and that I was aware of what the Arctic produces in terms of optical phenomena, and that what I had seen was not an optical phenomenon. He told me to log it and continue normal duties. I asked to speak with the previous posting officer. He said that was still not possible. I asked if the previous posting officer's name was Brennan. There was a pause. Not a long pause, not the pause of someone thinking, but the specific brief hesitation of someone who has been asked a question they have prepared an answer for and are deploying that answer rather than generating it fresh. He said that information was confidential. I said that Brennan was the last name in the officer logs and that Brennan's entries had gone convergent on February 17th of the previous year and that I wanted to know where Brennan was. Garrett disconnected the call. I stood with the satellite phone in my hand for a moment, and then I set it down carefully, and went to fix the perimeter motion sensors on the south fence, which had been triggering intermittently for 3 nights on stimuli I hadn't been able to identify, and which now felt like a maintenance priority of a different order than it had before. The north wall of the operations building is not an exterior wall. This is a fact about the depot's architecture that I had noted on my first day and filed under structural layout in the part of my mind that catalogs spaces. The AUXILE rebuilding is flush against the operations building's north face, the two structures sharing the wall completely, so that the operations building's north interior wall is simultaneously the AUXILE rebuilding's south interior wall is simultaneously the AUXILE rebuilding's south interior wall. There is no gap between them, no alley, no passage, no external access to that face of the operations building. Whatever is on the other side of the north wall is inside the AUXILE building, and the AUXILE building's only exterior access is the padlocked door on its own north face, which is padlocked from the outside with a lock I had not touched. On night 12, at 1:44 a.m., something knocked on the north wall of the operations room. I want to be precise about this because precision is what I have and what I rely on and what keeps the description from being dismissed as atmospheric suggestion. It was not a settling sound, not the thermal expansion and contraction of metal and cold, not the percussion of equipment vibrating in the generator shed. There was 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced, each one a clear single impact with the specific resonance of a knuckle or a hard object striking a flat surface from the other side. Deliberate, communication-shaped. I was conducting my 1 a.m. perimeter check in the northeast corner of the operations room when the knocking started, and simultaneously, not immediately after, not a few seconds later, but within the same breath, the temperature in the room dropped. I felt it before I saw it on the thermometer. The specific sensation of ambient warmth leaving a space faster than the building's heating system can compensate, which produces a cold that comes from the inside of the air rather than from outside, a cold that has no source in the walls or the floor. 6 degrees in 3 minutes. I was watching the thermometer and I watched the number fall with the specific steadiness of something that was not a mechanical malfunction. Mechanical malfunctions produce uneven drops. The temperature fluctuates as the heating system responds and partially compensates. This was steady. 6 degrees in 3 minutes, as if the room's heat were being drawn off in a direction that the heating system couldn't address because the direction wasn't a ventilation failure. 2 rules activated simultaneously. Rule 4 said to stand in the center of the room and wait for the temperature to restore. Rule 1 said to continue the perimeter check and log every anomaly. The 2 rules did not contradict each other in theory, but they conflicted in practice because the perimeter check required movement and Rule 4 required stillness, and I was standing in the northeast corner rather than the center. And if I moved to the center, I was prioritizing Rule 4, and if I stayed where I was prioritizing Rule 4, and either choice was a choice, and I needed to make it quickly because the knocking had started again. I moved to the center. I put my back to the south wall and I stood still the way Rule 4 specified, which meant not going to the windows, and I did not go to the windows even though the south windows were behind me, and therefore not the direction the rule was concerned with. And even though the academic part of my mind was noting that the rule specified not going to the windows without specifying which windows, and the practical part of my mind was overriding the academic part and keeping my feet exactly where they were. The second sequence of knocking was 7 impacts. Irregular. Not the precise spacing of the first 3, but the irregular sequence of something moving, traversing the north wall from east to west, each knock at a slightly different position than the last. The way sound travels when a body is moving along a surface and contacting it at intervals. It was tracking. The sequence of knocks was mapping the operations room, identifying the north wall's correspondence to the space on this side of it, and the movement was from east to west, which was from the direction of the filing cabinet toward the direction of the operations desk, and the operations desk was where I spent the majority of my logged hours, and I understood, standing in the center of the room, that the thing on the other side of the wall knew this. It had heard me working at the desk, and had been finding me through the wall by sound, and now it was standing directly behind the operations desk with the specific stillness of something that has located what it was looking for. One final knock. A single impact. Directly behind the desk chair, at the height a person's hand falls when they knock standing. Then silence. Then, slowly, over the next 4 minutes, the temperature climbed back to baseline. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the operations desk, because not sitting at the desk would have been a different kind of capitulation, a concession that the space behind me had been successfully claimed, and I wrote a 4-page log entry that was the most precise document I have ever produced. I described everything in the order it happened with the times attached. I described the temperature curve. I described the acoustic character of each knock, its approximate position on the north wall, the movement pattern of the 7-knock sequence. I described the silence that followed. I described standing in the center of the room. I did not describe how I felt about any of it because the log is an operational document and my feelings were not operational data, and also because I was not sure what to call the thing I was feeling, which was not purely fear. Fear, I know. Fear has a specific physiology and I am familiar with it from 9 years in the field. What I was feeling had fear in it, but also something else. Something that took me several nights to name and that I eventually named adjacency. The sense of being directly next to something enormous that has not yet decided what to do with you. In the morning I went outside in full gear and walked the exterior perimeter of the Auxiliary building. The padlock was secured, intact, locked from the outside. I pressed my ear against the exterior wall of the Auxiliary building, the south face, the face that corresponded to the north wall of the operations room, and I heard the receiver, not broadcasting, between transmissions, the state it occupies most of the time, a flat electronic hum that I had come to know the way you come to know the ambient sounds of a building you inhabit, the specific tonality of a machine running rather than functioning. The receiver was on the operations desk on the other side of 2 walls. It was also, audibly and clearly, inside the Auxiliary building. The sound was coming from inside the sealed structure with the locked exterior door, which meant either the receiver's acoustic range extended through walls in a way that no hardware specification could account for, or there were 2 receivers, or the receiver's relationship to its physical location was not the simple spatial correspondence I had assumed it was. I stood there with my ear against the cold metal wall, and the receiver hummed at me from both sides of the building simultaneously, and the cold was working its way through my gear and into my fingers, and I needed to go back inside, but I stood there a few seconds longer because I was trying to understand, and because I cannot stop trying to understand things, even when understanding them is the dangerous option. There is no sunrise at 70 degrees north in November. There is no twilight. There is a period each day, roughly between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m., when the sky at the southern horizon achieves a pale blue-gray luminescence, not light exactly, more the memory of light. the atmosphere performing an obligation from which the sun itself has been excused, and the depot and the airstrip and the flat tundra beyond become briefly visible as forms rather than merely as shapes in the perimeter illumination. Outside of that window, the world is dark. The south-facing windows of the operations building look out over the supply yard and the airstrip, and what they show for 22 hours of each 24 is a landscape defined by its artificial light sources, the perimeter floods, the motion sensors on the fence, the small red indicator lights on the runway's edge markers. The view is reliable. I had been looking at it for 17 nights and it had never changed in any way that wasn't accounted for by cloud cover or wind. On night 17, I was standing at the south window during my 1 a.m. check. I had developed a habit of pausing at this window, binoculars down, just looking at the supply yard in its ordinary state, the geometric comfort of structures in their correct positions and illuminated in their consistent way. It was a small ritual, and I was beginning to understand that small rituals were the psychological equivalent of the 3 clocks, a way of establishing consensus, of confirming that the agreed-upon world was still the world I was occupying. I was looking at the supply yard in the dark and I was doing fine, and then the view changed. Not the glass, the view. The window itself was unchanged, the same pane I had been looking through for 17 nights. The same faint condensation at the lower corner where the interior humidity meets the exterior cold. But through the glass, it was summer, full Arctic summer, the 2 a.m. gold of the midnight sun, the sky, that color that has no real name because it only exists for 8 weeks of the year, and only at this latitude, a flat, warm light that falls from a sun that never sets and produces no shadows because there is no angle from which to cast them. The supply yard was structurally identical to the yard I had been looking at in the dark. The same pallets, the same shelving units, the same security lights, off now. Unnecessary, irrelevant in a season where darkness requires effort rather than occurring naturally. The snow was gone. The ground was summer tundra, the specific green-brown of a landscape that has 8 weeks to be alive before it freezes again. Standing water in the low points, tussock grass, the small Arctic flowers that don't have time to grow tall and don't bother trying. Everything was where it should be, oriented the way it should be, real and specific, and not a reflection or projection, but a different temporal position of the same space, as if the window were showing me the yard in a season that was simultaneously here and 8 months away. And walking through the summer supply yard, moving between the pallets with the efficiency of someone doing a perimeter check they have done hundreds of times, was a figure in contractor's clothing. The walk was mine. I knew my own walk before I knew anything else about the figure, the specific slightly forward lean that search and rescue training builds in, the pace calibrated to cover ground efficiently without breaking into a run, the head movement pattern of someone scanning rather than simply looking. The figure crossed the yard and turned at the northeast corner of the warehouse, exactly where I turned in my own 1 a.m. checks, and the turn brought the face into profile, and the profile was mine, and then the figure looked up toward the window, toward me, and the face was fully resolved, and it was my face, not approximate, not similar. My specific face, every feature correctly placed, correctly proportioned, correctly lit by the summer sun that had no analog in the November night I was standing in. The summer version of me looked up and held my gaze for a moment, and then nodded once, a single slow acknowledgement, the nod of a person who has spotted a colleague across a yard and is confirming their presence before returning to work. Then the view reset. November dark, perimeter lights, the supply yard in the correct winter season, empty and still. I stood at the window for a while after that. I was doing the thing where you stay at the site of an anomaly because leaving the site feels like abandoning the evidence, which is a professional habit and also a way of managing the specific shock that an anomaly of that magnitude produces by converting it immediately into a workable category. Not what was that, but document this. I went to the filing cabinet. I pulled the logs. I found 2 previous officers who had documented summer window visions. Hartley, 4 postings ago, and Okafor, 2 postings before Hartley. Both had described the seasonal inversion, the window showing summer, the supply yard as it appeared in the brief warm season. Both had noted that a figure was visible in the summer scene. Both had written, in very similar language, given that they had no knowledge of each other's entries, that the figure had turned toward them and nodded. Both had also written, in language that was almost identical despite 4 years of separation, that they had found the nod reassuring, that it had felt, against all logic, like a greeting rather than a threat, that the inappropriateness of finding it reassuring was a fact they were noting in the log because it felt important to record. Hartley had completed his note with, "I am still not sure why a nod from my own face in a seasonal inversion should feel like comfort. I am recording that it did." Hartley had not completed his rotation. Okafor had not completed his rotation. I sat down and opened my log and wrote, "I found the nod reassuring. I am noting this as the wrong response. I am noting it anyway." Then I went to fix the weather stripping on the warehouse's east door, which had been letting in cold air for a week because Price had been right, that fixing the physical things was the closest available analog to sanity, and because the summer version of me in the supply yard had moved like someone who owned the space completely, like someone who had stopped being afraid of it so long ago that the fear was no longer even a reference point, and I found that thought more disturbing than the vision had been, and I wanted to be holding, it willed it. On night 21, I cut the padlock. I had been building toward this with the specific, methodical inevitability of a person who is established, through 20 nights of documentation and cross-referencing and fixing fuel intake valves and not answering the receiver, that the knowledge of what is in the AXI Leary building has become more necessary than the risk of knowing it. The rule had said, "Don't go near it after dark." The rule had given me the price of attention. The AUXI Leary building is aware of proximity. Attention is reciprocal. I had been aware of the AUXI Leary building since my first walkthrough. I had given it attention every time I conducted my 1 a.m. check and felt, through the north wall of the operations room, the particular quality of presence that a sealed space containing something can produce. Not a sound, not a temperature differential, but a weight in the air. The reciprocal awareness had been running since day one. The only question was whether I was going to know what I was already in a relationship with. I brought the bolt cutters from the warehouse supply. I brought a flashlight with fresh batteries. I brought my sidearm, which I had not touched since arrival. Standard issue for remote posting security. Loaded, still in its holster, still carrying the weight of something I had never once thought I would need in a supply depot posting, and now thought I might need in a way that the sidearm was entirely inadequate to address, but that the holding of it addressed in some other register. I brought the precise calm of someone who has decided that knowing is better than not knowing, even when knowing is the more dangerous option, which is a kind of calm that looks from the outside like composure and feels from the inside like walking into a river. The bolt cutters sheared the padlock shackle in a single compression. The door swung inward under its own weight, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, the way a door swings open when it has been sealed long enough that the air pressure differential between inside and outside produces a gentle pull. The air that came out was the same temperature as the outside, and not the same temperature as the operations building, which meant the auxiliary structure was not heated, which I had not established before because I had not been inside before and there was no way to measure it from outside. Flashlight first, my hand on the doorframe, then through. The auxiliary building was a single room, roughly 30 by 20 feet, with metal shelving along 3 walls, heavy industrial shelving, the kind built to hold equipment crates. The shelving held equipment, Cold War-era monitoring hardware, Soviet in origin, consoles and receivers, and what appeared to be atmospheric sensing equipment, the specific utilitarian aesthetic of Soviet military technology from the 1960s and 70s, olive green and black and built for function in extreme conditions. Some of it I recognized from photographs and technical histories of Cold War Arctic monitoring programs. All of it was old. None of it appeared to be actively powered. In the center of the room, on a desk older than the one in the operations building, wood rather than metal, scarred with decades of use, there was a receiver, identical to the one on the operations desk in the main building. Same model, same olive green casing, same analog dial fixed at the same position, same severed cable ending dangling from its back panel, the cut end oxidized in the way of a cable that has been disconnected for a very long time. Both receivers were active. I could hear them both. The one in the operations building through the shared wall, its hum reaching me even here, and this one, live, in the room I was standing in, both producing the same transmission simultaneously, the synchronization so precise that the doubled sound produced a slight acoustic effect, a tiny resonant interference pattern that made the hum richer than a single source could account for. On the wall above the AUXILERY desk, there were 9 photographs pinned to the metal surface in a straight horizontal line. Personnel photographs, the kind of formal headshots that contracting operations use for ID purposes. Standardized lighting, neutral backgrounds, the expression of someone who is told to look professional and cooperated. 9 faces, 9 names written below each photograph in black permanent marker. I knew all 9 names from the officer logs. I had been reading their handwriting for 2 weeks. Looking at their faces was a specific kind of recognition, the kind that comes when a voice you know resolves into a person you've never seen. Yevgeny looked older than I had imagined. Sujin looked younger. Brennan looked, and this is the word I used in the log I wrote later, after I had been through the whole room and processed everything I had found, and it is the most accurate word I found, settled. They all looked settled, not frightened, not distressed, not the faces of people who had been harmed or who were in the midst of being harmed. Settled, the word I use for a person who has found where they belong and have the specific relaxation of someone no longer looking. Pinned beneath the photographs, a single index card in small, careful printing. The receiver doesn't find you. You find the receiver. You always come in here eventually. That's why the lock faces out. I stood in the center of the auxiliary room and held my flashlight steady and read the index card twice. Then I looked at the padlock I had left on the floor outside the door, the severed pieces, the mechanism I had cut through with the bolt cutters. It had been locked from the outside. I had assumed it was locked to keep me out. The index card was telling me it was locked to keep something in. And what was in here was not a physical presence, but a function, not a captive, but a system. And the system's design feature was that the door only mattered in one direction, which was the direction away from it, which was the direction I had now definitively traveled, which meant the door was no longer the relevant architectural element. The thing the index card told me reordered everything I had documented in 21 nights of precise logs. The entity did not transmit the voices of previous posting officers because it had captured them. It transmitted their voices because they were still here, not bodily, not physically, but in frequency. The entity operated on the polar duct wavelength with the same mechanism as the receiver. And what it did was not possession or consumption or anything that the vocabulary of horror I had brought to this posting had a clean word for. It converted. It took the living signal of a person, the specific electromagnetic pattern of a particular consciousness, the thing that made Yevgeny and Sujin and Brennan, whoever Brennan had been before all of this, and it translated that pattern into a persistent radio transmission. The previous officers were still broadcasting. They were in the receiver. They were on the polar duct, 30 miles northwest from the permanent ice shelf that had no roads and no structures and no reason to emit a signal except that signal was now what they were. The AUXILERY building was not a storage room. It was a broadcast tower. And for 21 nights I had been sleeping 12 feet from the receiver with no barrier between my signal and its accumulation. And the receiver had been measuring me since I arrived, and I had already been giving it something simply by being present, and proximity was the mechanism, and I had just spent 21 nights in perfect proximity. I turned and walked back through the auxiliary door and stood in the covered walkway between the buildings, and the Arctic night was above me. And the 2 receivers were humming on both sides of the wall, and I stood there for a long time before I went back inside. I did not sleep for 3 nights after entering the AUXILERY building, not because I was afraid, or not only because of that, not in the way that fear produces sleeplessness through agitation. I did not sleep because I was thinking, and the thinking was the kind that does not pause for rest, the kind that arrives when you have been handed a piece of information that retroactively reorganizes a significant portion of your experience, and you need to go back through all of it with the new organizing principle and check whether the reorganization holds. It held. Every anomaly I had documented for 21 nights made different, deeper sense when read through the conversion framework. The figure on the tundra, one of the converted ones, still present in the landscape that had been their operational territory. The voice from the ice shelf in Sujin's frequency, exactly what she was now, a signal broadcasting from the coordinates of her new form. My own voice on the first night, reporting the weather from my own coordinates, not a recording, not a simulation, a signal that the receiver had already begun to accumulate, and that the polar duct had already begun to carry, a first thin harmonic of what I might become if the process continued to its natural completion. I ran on coffee and generator maintenance, and the specific focused quality that comes when everything is in full clarity, and clarity is the most awake state a person can occupy. I fixed 3 things in the depot that had been low on the maintenance priority list. I reorganized the medical supply inventory and updated the count logs for the first time in a month. I read every index card and equipment label in the AUXI Alliary building twice, by flashlight, making notes in my log, trying to understand the Soviet monitoring equipment's original function and how it related to the receiver's current one. And I thought about the 3 surviving officers, Price, Chen, and the third one whose name I had confirmed as Reyes, posting 2 years before Price, and what it was they had done differently, and whether doing the same things they had done was still available to me as a strategy now that I had walked through the AUXI Leary door. Price had fixed things. Chen had not listened to the receiver beyond logging its activations. Reyes had. I went back to Reyes's logs with fresh attention. Reyes had talked. Not on the receiver, not transmitted, but aloud, inside the operations building. A habit that appeared in the logs around week 3 of his posting, spoke aloud today while doing the check, just to have a voice in the room. Reyes had narrated his tasks to himself. The generator check, the supply inventory, the perimeter inspection. He had done all of it with a running verbal commentary that, reading the log, seemed partly practical and partly something else. An assertion. A frequency assertion. This voice belongs to this body, and this body is here doing this task, and this is what here sounds like when it belongs to a person who is moving through it, rather than being accumulated by it. I started doing the same thing. I talked through every task I performed. I described what I was doing and why, and what I expected to find, and what I did find, and what I intended to do next. A steady low stream of first-person narration that filled the operations room with a sound that was mine and was specific, and was not what the receiver was producing. It helped. I cannot quantify it more precisely than that. It helped in the way that Price's mechanical repairs helped, and Chen's disciplined non-listening helped. It was a practice of remaining specifically oneself while something patient and cumulative was working at the edges of that specificity. On night 24 at 1:33 a.m., the receiver activated. I logged the time. All 3 clocks agreed. The transmission began as standard weather data, coordinates, cloud ceiling, visibility, wind speed, the formatted sequence of a professional meteorological report. My voice. I had been hearing my voice in the receiver for 23 nights, and had developed the practiced detachment of a person who has decided to treat a familiar stimulus as data rather than as communication, the way Chen had treated the activations as time and duration rather than content. But the transmission continued past the weather report, past where a standard format ends, into something that stopped my pen on the log page. My voice, on the receiver, began describing the depot's operational systems, the generator, maintenance cycles, fuel consumption curves, the temperature thresholds at which each component required manual attention, the supply warehouse inventory protocols, the heating system's zone controls and their appropriate winter settings. The voice was doing this with the fluency of someone who had been running these systems for months, for a full winter, for a duration that had built the kind of operational knowledge that only residence produces. And then it reached the secondary generator's fuel intake valve, the valve that sticks in temperatures below -40, the valve I had identified and learned to reset through trial and error across my first 3 weeks at the depot, the valve I had fixed twice a week since I discovered the pattern, and it described the specific manual reset procedure with complete accuracy. The exact sequence of the valve position, the pressure point, the release mechanism, everything correct, everything I had figured out alone and never described to anyone, not in the logs, not on the satellite phone, not in the daily operational notes. My voice in the receiver knew this thing that I had never said aloud. My voice knew this depot with a depth that my voice should not yet have, a depth that required more time than I had been here, more time than my body had spent in the building, unless there was a version of time in which the signal that was running ahead of me had already accumulated more than 24 days of this station, more than 24 days of this station, more than 24 days of the receiver, measuring the specific pattern of my attention and my knowledge, and the way I moved through this space. I sat at the operations desk and listened to my voice. Know this place, and I felt, for the first time since arrival, something that I sat with for 2 nights. Before I wrote it in the log, I felt less alone. The operations room was dark except for the monitor and the receiver's indicator light, and I felt less alone. And that felt important to document, even though the clinical part of my mind was already noting that it was exactly the wrong response to exactly the wrong response to exactly the right trigger. The transmission ended. Then, after a pause of approximately 4 seconds, long enough to feel like a breath or a choice, my voice returned in a slightly different register, warmer, less operational. It said, "Polar duct stable, signal strong. This is Mallory yet Kilo, signing off." Another pause. "Then you're doing better than I did at this point. You haven't answered back yet. Keep not answering." The receiver clicked to static. I stared at the olive-green casing for a very long time. The converted signal that was running ahead of my body, that had already learned this depot more thoroughly than my 24 days of occupancy could account for. That signal was trying to protect me. It was using its surplus knowledge to warn me away from the completion of the process it had already undergone. Either this was the most sophisticated and patient psychological entrapment I had ever encountered, or it was the most honest message I had ever received, and the unbearable thing was that I had no mechanism to tell the difference, and both possibilities kept me awake until the heating ducts began their morning tick, and the pale pre-dawn non-light appeared at the southern horizon, and I made coffee and talked aloud, through making it, narrating every step, asserting with each word that the voice in this room was here, and was not yet only a service. The acetone was in the warehouse's cold weather equipment maintenance section, behind the ski wax and the waterproofing compound, standard items for Arctic postings. Unremarkable, the kind of chemical I had walked past every day for 26 days, without registering it as relevant to anything except gear maintenance. On night 26, I walked past it and stopped and stood in the warehouse aisle for a moment, and then picked up the can and carried it back to the operations building. And I knew what I was going to do with it, and I knew that doing it was the kind of step that could not be undone once taken, and I took it anyway because I am the kind of person who takes those steps and who will probably, in the end, take every step that presents itself as the next logical one in a sequence, and this was the next logical one in a sequence, and this was the next logical and I worked slowly, cotton swabs one at a time, applying acetone to the raised rectangle of layered correction fluid that covered Rule 5, letting each application soften the topmost layer before removing it, moving through the laminate the way you move through sediment when you are recovering something fragile from beneath it. Archaeological patience, search and rescue patience, the patience of a person who has learned that rushing a recovery is how you damage what you are trying to recover. The correction fluid had been applied in multiple coats, and the coats came off in sequence, and I worked for 2 hours at the operations desk with the cotton swabs and the acetone and the rule sheet held at an angle to the lamp so I could see the dissolving layers without losing the text as it emerged. The text emerged, small, careful print, the same hand as the rest of the rules, not Brennan's hand, which I now recognized from the supply logs as tighter and more compressed than this, but the earlier hand, the person who had first put the rules in the binder. The text read, "The conversion process requires consent at its final stage. This is not negotiable from the entity's side. It is a structural requirement, not a mercy. The entity cannot complete the frequency transfer without a moment of deliberate two-way communication. One transmission sent, one received and acknowledged. This is why Rule 2 exists. This is why Rule 2 is the only rule with a price measured in irreversibility rather than consequence." The previous officers who did not complete their rotations all answered the receiver. Some answered because they were frightened. Some answered because they were lonely. Some answered because the voice they heard was someone they missed so much that the missing of it overrode every other calculation. The receiver has your mother's voice ready. It has had it since approximately your third week on station. It has not used it yet because it is patient and because it knows it has learned from 9 previous postings that the most effective moment to use a specific voice is not when you are most frightened, but when you are most tired of being frightened. I covered this rule because I did not finish this posting. I covered it so you would have to work to find it, because anything you have to work to find you hold differently than something handed to you. You are smarter than I was. Use that, Brennan. I read it 3 times. The third reading was slower than the first 2 because by the third reading I was reading it as a document rather than as information, reading it for the person in it, for Brennan, who had written this from inside the conversion process, from inside whatever state of being the frequency transfer had left him in, 4 days after his own February 17th convergence entry, in handwriting that was looser and larger than his operational log writing, the handwriting of someone who had stopped needing to be careful in the way that running assistants. He had covered the rule deliberately. He had covered it so that whoever came next would have to want to find it badly enough to work for it, because the wanting and the working were a form of preparation that being handed the rule directly could not provide. He had done this for me, or for whoever I was in the sequence, and he had done it from a position of having failed the test himself, and the combination of the care and the act and the failure that preceded it was the hardest thing I had encountered at Coldframe Station Kilo, and I had encountered things that had tested every professional and personal resource I possessed. I put down the cotton swab. I sat on the operations floor with my back against the desk because the desk chair had too much association with the receiver and the receiver's direction and the rule I had just read about what the receiver was holding. I had not cried since the incident that ended my search and rescue career, a winter recovery operation on the Brooks Range in which my team made a decision I made the right call on and that killed 2 people anyway, which is the specific grief of having been correct and having it cost exactly as much as being wrong would have. I did not cry on the operations floor at Coldframe Station Kilo, but I sat there for a long time with the rule sheet in my hand, reading Brennan's sign-off over and over, and I thought about my mother, who had died in the spring after my medical discharge in a hospital in Fairbanks, while I was 300 miles away in a recovery facility still learning to hear through the left side hearing loss that the Brooks Range incident had given me as a souvenir, unable to drive, unable to fly, unable to get to her in time. The last phone call I had with her was on a Wednesday morning, and she was worried about me. I could hear it in the specific register her voice used when she was trying to not let the worry show, a register I knew from childhood, from every time I had done something she considered reckless, which was many times, and she told me that story about the winter I learned to ski and fell halfway down the practice hill, and she had carried me home on her back because I was 9 years old and too proud to walk, and she had pretended she needed the exercise. I had not heard that story in the 4 years since she died. I had thought about it. I had replayed it in the specific private way that people replay the last things they said to someone they love. But I had not heard it. At 2014 a.m., the receiver activated. The voice that came through was not mine. It was not Sujin's or Brennan's or any of the 9 previous officers. It was my mother's voice, the specific timbre of it, the slight catch in the consonants that she had all her life, and that I had forgotten I knew until I heard it again. The rhythm of her speech that was slightly faster than average because she was always thinking ahead of the words, and she was not doing a weather report. She was telling a story, the winter I learned to ski, the fall halfway down the practice hill, the carrying me home on her back, the pretense of needing the exercise. She told it exactly as I remembered it. Every detail correct, including details I had not consciously remembered, until I heard them, and then they were suddenly there, present and true. The color of my ski jacket that winter, a red so bright it was almost orange. The name of the hill, the specific quality of the cold that day, my mother's voice on the receiver, the frequency the entity had been holding since my 3rd week on station, chosen for the moment I was most tired of being afraid. I stood at the operations desk with my hands flat on the surface, both hands pressed hard enough that I could feel the edge of the desk's frame through my palms. My hands were shaking, not from cold. The building was heated to standard temperature and had been for 26 days. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from the specific whole-body response that comes when something you have been missing longer than you realized suddenly becomes present in the room, and the part of you that does not perform cost-benefit analyses is already halfway to saying yes before the part that does has formed the full analysis. I did not speak. I will write this in the simplest available language because the simplest available language is the most accurate to the experience. I stood at the desk with my shaking hands and my mother's voice in the room, and I did not speak, and it was the hardest thing I have done since the Brooks Range, and it is possible it was harder. My mother's voice continued for 11 minutes. Then it stopped. The receiver hummed. I remained at the desk for a further 40 minutes before I moved. I wrote in the log "Odu 4214, receiver active, female voice, English, personal content." 11 minutes, did not respond. Hands still shaking as of 0344. Logging this as evidence that the rule held and the price of holding it is what Brennan described. He was right about the timing. He was right about everything. The ice road south closes in October. It runs 400 miles from the depot's access track to the main highway, across terrain that is impassable by wheeled vehicle for 5 months of the year. Not snow-covered road, but road that only exists as road when the tundra is frozen solid enough to carry weight. A surface that is highway in winter and swamp in summer, and that has a specific beauty in both states that I had been aware of from my first flight over it. The pale packed line of it running south through the brown and white landscape. I had watched it from the operations window on clear nights since November. It was my orientation marker. It was the line that led, eventually, back to the world with more than 4 people in it. It was closed until April, and I was here until April. And between now and then it was a reference point rather than an exit, but the knowing it was there had its own value. On night 28, the ice road was lit, not by the depot's perimeter system, which does not reach the road from this distance, not by headlights. I knew what headlights looked like on the ice road from my own drive-in, the specific intensity and directional quality of a vehicle's forward illumination, and this was not that. What was moving along the road from the south, approaching the depot slowly and steadily, was a soft, diffuse luminescence, even and sourceless, approximately the height above the road surface that a person's torso occupies if the person is standing. It was moving at a walking pace, unhurried, covering the distance from where I first picked it up in the binoculars to the depot's outer fence in approximately 40 minutes of observation. I watched it the whole way. I tracked it with the binoculars, a soft pale light maintaining its height and its pace, not varying, not flickering the way a flame-based light source flickers, not directional the way an electric light is directional, just present and moving and arriving. When it reached the outer fence perimeter, it stopped. The fence gate was padlocked. I had checked the gate lock that morning as part of my standard perimeter inspection, and the lock had been properly secured. Standard condition, nothing to note. The light waited at the gate for 4 minutes. I timed it. Then it moved west along the fence, tracing the perimeter from the outside, moving at the same walking pace, consistent, unhurried, not rushing the fence and not retreating from it. I followed it with the binoculars. At the northwest corner of the fence, it stopped again for approximately 90 seconds, and then it moved north, off the road, off the fence line, out onto the open tundra, away from the depot. I tracked it until it moved beyond the range of my optics, which at maximum magnification and good Arctic visibility is a significant distance, and it maintained its pace and its luminescence until it was simply too far away to resolve. In the morning, full gear, full cold weather kit, I walked to the northwest corner of the fence. The snow was undisturbed. No track, no ground compression, no physical sign of passage. I had not expected tracks. 28 nights of observation had calibrated my expectations. I put my hand on the fence post at the northwest corner. Through my insulated glove, I felt warmth. I took the glove off, briefly, in -36, briefly is the operative word, and pressed my bare palm against the metal post, and the metal was warm the way metal gets when something at body temperature has been in contact with it for an extended period. Not ambient warmth. Contact warmth. The post had been held or leaned against or in contact with a heat-producing presence for long enough to transfer that heat into steel in conditions that would normally drain warmth from metal in minutes. I stood at the northwest corner of the fence with my bare hand on the warm post and looked north at the tundra in the pre-dawn non-light and thought about the ice road behind me, running south, closed until April, now confirmed as a route the entity traversed. I had been thinking of the ice road as a psychological anchor. The road is there, the road goes south in April, the road opens. I revised that framework while standing at the fence post. The road was there, the road did go south. In April it would open. All of that was still true. None of it was the comfort it had been yesterday, because the road was also the route the entity had used to arrive at the fence, and the southern direction from which it had come was the direction of civilization, and what that meant about the range of its territory was something I was not prepared to fully calculate yet. I called the contracting office. No answer. I called the emergency line. No answer. I called the Alaska State Troopers post nearest to the depot's access point, 200 miles south, because I am methodical, and methodical people exhaust the institutional options before accepting that the institutions have reclassified the situation as outside their competence. The trooper who answered was professional and patient. I described everything: the entity, the receiver, the voices, the figure on the tundra, the light on the ice road, the warm fence post, the 9 previous officers whose handwriting had converged by February. The trooper listened without interrupting, which I respected. When I finished, he asked carefully whether I had my medication with me. I told him I did not take medication. He asked whether there was anyone he should contact. I gave him my sister's number in Juneau and told him I was operationally stable and that I was not asking for an extraction, just noting the situation in the institutional record. He said he would file the report, and I thanked him, and we both understood that we were conducting a courtesy procedure rather than an escalation protocol. I was now in the institutional record of the Alaska State Troopers, a solo man in an Arctic depot who was experiencing a psychological event. The rule sheet on the operations desk was the only document in existence that took what I knew as accurate data rather than symptom. I found this clarifying rather than comforting, which I thought was probably the right response. That night, I counted the remaining days until April 53. I went back to the maintenance checklist and identified everything that still needed fixing and organized the items by priority. Then I sat down at the desk and began reading Brennan's operational log entries from the beginning, looking for anything I had missed when I read them as historical record rather than as the writing of someone who was now in the receiver and broadcasting from the ice shelf, someone whose conversion I now understood from the inside in a way I hadn't the first time I'd read them, and I took notes. The supply log binders were organized by year in the filing cabinet, and each year's binder contained the daily entries from October through April, the full winter rotation, or as much of it as the posting officer had completed. Brennan's binder was the most recent before mine, and I had read it early in my posting as part of the initial survey that had revealed the convergence pattern. I had identified the February 17th convergence entry, the tight compressed handwriting, the "I think I understand what it wants, I think I am going to try talking to it tonight," and I had cataloged Brennan as a non-completion, like 6 of the 9 before him, and I had moved on to studying the survivors. I had not gone back to Brennan's binder after that. On night 30 I did. The formal log ended on February 17th. The binder's back cover was tucked shut, and I opened it to replace the binder in the cabinet and felt the slight additional thickness of pages that had been folded and tucked into the cover's inner pocket, the kind of storage you use when you have loose pages that belong with a document but aren't part of its official structure. I pulled them out, 3 sheets of paper handwritten dated February 21st, 4 days after Brennan's last operational log entry, 4 days after the convergence entry in which Brennan had written in the tight, narrowed hand of late-posting handwriting that he was going to try talking to the receiver, 4 days after a posting officer's recorded disappearance in the specific handwriting of someone who had stopped being careful because careful no longer applied, large, loose, the letters with the open quality of writing produced without the compression of stress, the handwriting I think I would have recognized as Brennan's even without the context, because there was something of the person in it rather than the performance of the person that operational log writing produces. Brennan wrote, I answered on the 17th. I want whoever reads this to know that I don't regret it the way you would expect me to regret it. I regret that I didn't finish the instructions for whoever came next. I regret that I let it use Sarah's voice when I was tired. She has been gone 6 years and I was so tired. I want you to know that it is not what I thought. I thought it would take everything. It doesn't take everything. It takes the frequency, and the frequency is, and here there was a pause in the writing, a longer gap between letters than the ones before, as if Brennan had stopped to find the right analogy. Think of it as the signal that makes you specifically you rather than just a human. That frequency is still here. I am still here in the sense that I am still specifically me. I am just broadcasting rather than embodied. That distinction matters less than I thought it would. Whoever you are, don't answer the way I answered, lonely and in the dark on a Tuesday. If you're going to answer, and I think you might be, I think you're the kind of person who eventually has to know. Answer because you chose it. That's the only difference it makes. I read it 4 times. Then I folded it and put it in my breast pocket. I have been carrying it since. The distinction between lonely on a Tuesday and choosing it. The distinction between being consumed and being converted. And between conversion as loss and conversion as a different kind of presence. The distinction between the person who answers because the missing has become unbearable and the person who answers because they have understood everything available to understand and have decided. Brennan was telling me that the difference between those 2 answers was real and that it was the only difference that remained available to make, and the care in the telling. The care of a person who had written from inside the frequency to leave a message in the handwriting of someone who had found the thing on the other side to be different from what the fear had made it sound like. That care was the most precise act of communication I had encountered at Cold Frame Station Kilo, or possibly anywhere. That night the receiver activated at 1:01 a.m., before the polar duct was stable, before the standard transmission window, before the conditions that the rules described as the prerequisite for signal. I logged the time, 1001. The 3 clocks agreed, and then the receiver produced a sound I had no precedent for in 29 nights of activation logs. All 10 voices simultaneously, not in sequence, not one after another in the pattern of previous multi-voice activations. Together, all 10 of them at once, each broadcasting at a different frequency register, each in the specific timbre of who they had been. Yevgeny at the low end, Soo-jin at a precise mid-register, Hartley's chatty warmth filling the upper range, and my own voice somewhere in the middle, neither the lowest nor the highest but present, woven into the chord with the same weight as the others. 10 voices producing a simultaneous transmission that should have been cacophony. 10 different languages and cadences and registers occupying the same acoustic space at the same moment, and was not, was something that I sat with for a long time before I would let myself use the word for it, which was music. Not pleasant music, not comfortable music, but music in the technical sense, a structured relationship between frequencies that produced something more coherent than the sum of its parts. I wrote in the log, I understand the difference Brennan was describing. I am writing this down so whoever reads this knows I understood it before I made any decision. On night 33, I sat at the operations desk with a blank sheet of paper and began to write. I had been thinking about this for 3 nights with the steady quality of consideration that arrives when a decision has been made at a level below conscious reasoning and is now waiting for the conscious mind to catch up and authorize it. The paper was Depot Supply, standard white printer stock, the same paper the 12 years of log entries had been printed on. The pen was mine, from my gear, a specific brand of ballpoint that works reliably in cold temperatures, and that I had been carrying since my search and rescue days because reliable equipment is the minimum requirement of situations that do not have a maximum. I wrote Rule 1 first, the perimeter check, the 1 a.m., timing, the scope of what to log, and then the price. But I wrote the price with a specificity that Brennan's earlier version had lacked, because I had 26 days of documented observations behind the price now, and could describe not just what happened when you stopped looking, but what the progression felt like from the inside. The specific quality of the reclassification from observer to inventory, and why that particular framing was the accurate one rather than the more obvious framings available. I wrote it for a stranger under stress who would need to understand the rule not just as a requirement, but as a description of a real mechanism, which is the difference between a rule and a useful rule. Rule 2, the receiver. I wrote this one carefully, because I had more to say about it than anyone before me had known to say. I knew about the consent mechanism. I knew about the two-way channel and what establishing it meant precisely, not just the irreversibility, but the nature of the thing that became irreversible. Not death, not harm, but translation, conversion, a change of state that preserved the essential and altered the form. I wrote this as accurately as I could. I wrote, the previous rules described the price as irreversibility. That is accurate but incomplete. The irreversibility is not a punishment. It is the nature of the destination. You cannot arrive at a place and then unarrive. That is what the price means. Rule 3, Rule 4, Rule 6. I wrote all of them with the same attention, longer than the originals, more specific, more useful, I thought, than what had been in the binder when I arrived, because I had spent 33 nights accumulating the specific knowledge that made these rules make sense, and I was going to transfer that knowledge in the most complete form available to me. When I reached the space for Rule 5, I stopped. I sat for 20 minutes. I thought about Brennan covering it in correction fluid, the multiple thick coats, the raised slab, the deliberateness of the concealment, the not yet scratched in the paper below it. I thought about myself dissolving the layers with acetone, the 2-hour process, the cotton swabs, the emerging text. I thought about what Brennan had been doing with the concealment, not preventing the next person from knowing, but ensuring they had to want to know badly enough to work for it, because the people who would work for it, who would not accept not yet as a permanent answer, who would find the acetone and apply it layer by layer with archaeological patience, were the people for whom the knowledge would do the most good. The people who reached Rule 5 by force of their own specific character were the people capable of using it. I wrote Rule 5. I wrote it in the largest print on the page. I wrote it completely, without omission, the consent mechanism, the emotional weapon, the timing principle, the distinction between answering because you are lonely and answering because you choose. I wrote Brennan's insight explicitly because it deserved to be explicit, because Brennan had written it from inside the frequency at some cost, and it should not have to be rediscovered independently by whoever came next. I read the full rule back to myself. Then I picked up the correction fluid from the supply desk. I applied one coat, thin and quick, not building the raised slab that Brennan had built, not making the text invisible, but making it a shadow. There, if you held the page at the right angle, legible to anyone who looked at the page, with the specific attention of someone who had arrived at this rule through the others and understood why it might be obscured and therefore knew to look. I was not hiding it. I was giving the next person something to find rather than something that was either fully present or fully absent. I was making the act of finding it part of the preparation for using it. This is the distinction between Brennan's desperate concealment and my considered one. Brennan had covered it to protect someone from knowing too soon. I covered it to ensure the knowing arrived at the right weight. I got the emergency provisions binder from the shelf beside the filing cabinet. I removed the original rule sheet from the front cover, the sheet Brennan had updated from the original, which had been updated from whoever wrote it first, the first posting officer who had survived long enough to understand the system and generous enough to try to describe it. I replaced it with my sheet. The binder went back on the shelf. The corruption arc, as I was able to recognize it from the outside, had not felt like corruption from the inside. It had felt like comprehension arriving in stages, each stage more internally coherent than the last, each stage harder to argue with because the argument against it required believing that the previous stage had been wrong. And I had the logs of 29 other people who had gone through the stages, and I had the specific quality of being a person who cannot stop following the evidence wherever it goes. I did not feel corrupted. I felt complete in a way that was different from any previous completeness. I felt like a person who has reached the end of an investigation and found that the answer has a form they had not anticipated, and that the form is not the comfort they were hoping for, and is also not the horror they were afraid of, but is something more specific than either, something with its own particular weight and its own particular weight and its own particular clarity and its own particular clarity and its own particular kind of rightness that required all 33 nights of documentation to produce. That night I put on the receiver headset for the first time. I had never touched it before, had always sat beside it and logged its activations without physical contact. maintaining a careful distance from the object itself, the way you maintain a careful distance from something hot when you are not sure of its exact temperature. The headset was warm, not room temperature warm, not the ambient warmth of an object in a heated building. Warm the way a thing is warm when it has been used recently by a person, the specific thermal residue of contact. I put it on and sat at the operations desk, and the polar duct was open, and the signal was clear. And for 47 minutes I listened to 10 voices transmitting simultaneously in the chord I had first heard on night 30. I listened with the headset on and my eyes open and my hands in my lap, and I let the chord fill the space between my ears completely. Each voice at its specific register, each one still specifically itself. Brennan's voice still carrying the register of someone who had been tired and had rested. Sujin's still precise. Hartley's still warm, and my own voice somewhere in the middle of them. The voice that had been running ahead of me since the first night, already knowing this place at the depth that only time produces. When the duct closed and the receiver went to static, I took the headset off and set it on the desk. I had not spoken. I sat in the quiet for a while with the specific quality of a person who has made a decision they are not yet enacting, which is different from the quiet of someone who doesn't know what they're going to do. The decision was real. The execution was still ahead of me. Those were two different things, and I held the difference carefully, and then I went to bed and slept through the night for the first time in 11 days. The ice road opened on April 3rd. I know this because I watched it open, stood at the south window in the early morning light of a day that actually had light in it. The sun finally above the horizon after months of the pale non-dawn I had been living inside, and watched the contractor's road crew come up from the south in a tracked maintenance vehicle to survey the surface, and the surface was solid, and the road was officially passable, and I had been waiting for this with the specific patience of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the logistics to align, rather than the pace at which just had to set out to see at the end. The supply flight landed on April 7th. The Cessna Caravan, not Kowalczyk this time, a different pilot whose name I didn't know and whose manner was the same. Efficient, uncommunicative, focused on the turnaround. The new posting officer came off the plane with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a carry-on in his hand, and the look of someone who has been told that the isolation is manageable and has decided to believe that, which is the look I imagine I had on my face when I climbed off the same aircraft 5 months before. His name was Halverson. I knew it from the advance paperwork the contracting office had sent through the satellite uplink. Halverson, M33, former military, clean service record, no noted medical concerns. Former military and methodical, I saw both in the way he stepped off the plane and scanned the depot layout before he picked up his bag, taking in the perimeter first and the building second, the specific priority ordering of a person trained to assess a new location for variables before details. I met him on the airstrip. I looked well. I know this because I had looked in the mirror that morning for the first time in several weeks and noted the way I looked with the same clinical attention I give anomalous readings in the log, and what I saw was a person who had lost weight in the way that people lose weight when they stop eating recreationally and eat for function, and who had the specific posture of someone whose relationship to their environment had achieved a settled equilibrium. I had been efficient for months. I was efficient on the airstrip, meeting Halverson with a handshake, leading him through the orientation without rushing and without withholding. I showed him the buildings in sequence, operations first, then warehouse, then generator shed. I walked him through the generator system with the thoroughness of someone who had been running it for 5 months, and whose relationship to its quirks was by now entirely physical, not knowledge consulted but knowledge embodied. The way the fuel intake valve specific resistance informed the palm before the mind cataloged it. I told him about the secondary generator's fuel intake valve, the sticking threshold, the manual reset sequence. I told him clearly and specifically. I told him without drama because it was operational information, and dramatic delivery of operational information is the delivery style of someone who wants to make an impression rather than convey content. Halverson nodded and took notes in a small notebook with the shorthand of a person who takes notes in the field rather than at a desk. Good notes. I showed him the receiver. I described it with the same care I gave any critical piece of equipment. Operational parameters, known behaviors, maintenance considerations. I described the polar duct activation windows, the typical transmission frequency across a winter rotation, the log protocol. I said, The receiver activates between 1 and 3 a.m. during duct conditions, log time and duration. The manual is on the desk. I did not say, "Do not respond." The rule sheet would say, "Do not respond." The rule sheet would explain why. My role in this particular transition was orientation, not persuasion, and there is a difference between giving someone the information they need and telling them what to do with it. Halverson looked at the receiver with the measured attention of a person who was filing something under assess further rather than under understood. Correct response. At the end of the orientation, I opened the emergency provisions binder and took out the rule sheet and handed it across. I said, "Previous posting left instructions. I updated them. They're useful." Halverson read them standing at the desk, not sitting the way you read something you're actively assessing rather than passively receiving. He went through rules 1 through 4 and 6 with the expression of a person encountering something that is either the coherent framework of a serious operational context or the carefully structured document of someone who had been alone too long and who was in the process of deciding which. He reached the space for Rule 5 and paused. The correction fluid was a single thin layer. The text beneath it was a shadow, visible when the page was angled toward the desk lamp, legible to anyone who looked with the attention of someone who had reached Rule 5 through the first 4 and understood that the 5th one warranted looking carefully. He asked, "What's under the correction fluid?" He was not being aggressive about it. He was noting the anomaly in the same way I had noted anomalies in my log for 5 months. Direct, factual, no emotional loading. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about how to give him the most useful answer I could in a single sentence, which is the challenge of every rule sheet, every transition briefing, every handoff between one person and the next in a system that has been running longer than any individual's posting. I said, "You'll know when to read it." He held my gaze for a moment. He nodded once, the single slow nod of someone filing an answer under "This person is telling me something I can't fully use yet, but that I should keep," and put the rule sheet on the desk next to the receiver. I picked up my duffel bag. I shook his hand. I walked to the Cessna and I loaded my bag into the cargo area and I got in and I did not look back at the depot, not because the leaving was difficult, but because I had already done everything available to do in that place and for that person, and looking back would have been a form of uncertainty that I had resolved. The plane banked south, and the depot fell away below me and then behind me, and then was a speck in the white-brown of the north slope, spring, and then was nothing. Halverson went back to the operations building. He set the new rule sheet on the desk next to the receiver. He did his first interior perimeter check. I know this because I know what Halverson's operational approach is from 40 minutes of observation on the airstrip, and his first interior perimeter check was thorough and systematic and executed with the precise efficiency of someone who has decided the rules are worth taking seriously. At 1 a.m. on his first night, the receiver activated. I know this too, though I was 400 miles south and falling further south by the minute. A polar duct, early in the season. The transmission in English, a male voice, calm and professional. Fairbanks assented, providing a standard weather observation report, the coordinates exact. Halverson wrote down the time. He did not respond. He walked to the back of the operations room and began to count to 60, because Halverson has always given himself a margin, as I could have told you from watching him scan the depot perimeter from the aircraft steps before picking up his bag. When he came back to the desk, receiver was transmitting the new voice alongside the previous ones, 10 voices plus one just beginning, a signal that was mostly embodied but with its first thin harmonic already separating from the source, the first tiny fraction of Halverson's specific frequency already accumulating in the receiver's measure. In the auxiliary building, the receivers hummed the same chord they always hummed. Slightly richer now, the 10th voice's beginning resonance adding its first note to the permanent broadcast that the polar duct would carry north and north and north to the ice shelf where the accumulated signals were, still specifically themselves, still broadcasting at the specific frequencies of who they each were. A choir made of people who had come to Coldframe Station Kilo for a winter and stayed in the way that you stay somewhere. And after the leaving has stopped, they take the verbiage on the south window of the operations building, right at face height, on the interior surface of the glass, there was a breath mark in the condensation, still warm. the entity calibrating to the new occupant, beginning the long patient process of the winter, the careful accumulation, the precise timing, everything exactly as it should be. The last thing I saw from the plane before the clouds closed over the north slope was the ice road. 400 miles of packed snow running south toward the highway and the cities, and everything warm-lit and seasonally appropriate and full of people who had not spent 5 months alone at 70 degrees north learning what presence means when it stops being about the body. I had driven that road that morning in the contractor vehicle, and I had not looked in the rearview mirror once. Not because the leaving was hard, because I had already said everything available to say to that place in the only language it understood, which was frequency, which was the electromagnetic signature of a specific person paying full and uninterrupted attention for a very long time. I had said it, and the saying was complete, and the completion was real. And Brennan had been right that the only difference that mattered was whether it was a choice, and I had chosen it, and the choosing was still present in me, solid and unmistakable, the way things stay present when they were genuinely yours. The depot is staffed, the receiver is running. The new officer is counting to 60 in the back room, giving himself a margin. Because that is who Halverson is. The system does not need me anymore. It has what it needs. It has always known what it needs and has known how to wait for it. Across 12 years and 11 postings now, with the patience of something that operates on geological time inside a building, that runs on a generator. The rules are on the desk. The rule sheet has a single thin layer of correction fluid over Rule 5, through which the text is legible to anyone who angles the page correctly toward the light. The breathmark on the south window is still warm. The ice road is open. Everything is exactly as it should be.